At 90 years old, most people expected Eleanor Whitmore to be preparing for endings, not beginnings. The word again rarely appeared in conversations about her life anymore. Neighbors spoke softly, as if volume itself might fracture her age. Doctors praised her remarkable stability with the careful tone reserved for antiques. Even her own family, loving, practical, and tired, believed her days of trying something new had passed. But Eleanor had never lived by other people's timelines. She lived in a small coastal town where the sea smelled of salt and rusted anchors, where mornings arrived with gull cries and evenings folded themselves into quiet. Her house stood at the end of a narrow lane, white paint peeling, windows fogged with memories. It was the same house she had moved into at 23, the same place where she had raised 2 children, buried a husband, and learned to sleep with half the bed empty. For the last decade, Eleanor's life had shrunk. Not dramatically. No single catastrophe, no thunderclap. Just a gradual narrowing. Fewer walks. Shorter conversations. Friends passing away one by one like lamps going out at dusk. Her hands had grown stiff, her hearing unreliable. And after a fall the previous winter, everyone agreed, it was time for her to slow down. They didn't ask Eleanor what she wanted. The idea came to her on an ordinary morning. She was standing by the kitchen window, watching a young woman struggle with a broken bicycle chain. The girl cursed, laughed at herself, wiped grease on her jeans, and tried again. Eleanor smiled. Something warm stirred in her chest, an old, familiar feeling she hadn't named in years. Possibility. Decades ago, Eleanor had been a seamstress. Not famous, not wealthy, but good. Very good. She could turn plain cloth into elegance, could see shapes before scissors ever touched fabric. When her children were young, she sewed late into the night, hemming dresses, repairing coats, creating wedding gowns for neighbors who couldn't afford boutiques. Then life happened. Her husband fell ill. Medical bills piled up. Sewing became a luxury she couldn't afford in time or energy. Eventually, her sewing machine was pushed into a corner, covered with a sheet, and forgotten. That morning, Eleanor pulled the sheet off. The machine was dusty but intact. She ran her fingers over the metal, feeling the weight of years. Her hands trembled, not from weakness, but from recognition. That afternoon, she oiled the parts, replaced the needle, and tested the pedal with careful pressure. The first stitch was crooked. The second snapped the thread. Eleanor laughed out loud, a surprised, delighted sound that startled even her. When her daughter Margaret visited later that week, she found fabric spread across the dining table. "Mom, what's this?" Margaret asked, concern already forming. "I'm sewing," Eleanor said simply. Margaret hesitated. "Is that safe?" "Your hands." "They're steady enough," Eleanor replied. "They remember." Margaret didn't argue, but she sighed. That sigh carried years of worry, exhaustion, and love tangled together. "You don't have to prove anything," she said gently. Eleanor looked up. "I'm not proving," she said. "I'm beginning." Word traveled slowly at first. Eleanor fixed a torn jacket for a neighbor. Altered a dress for a widow attending her grandson's graduation. Someone posted a photo online, 90-year-old local seamstress brings magic back to fabric. Orders followed, not many, but enough. Some people were kind. Others were skeptical. "Isn't she too old?" they whispered. "What if she makes a mistake?" A few suggested Margaret should stop her mother before she gets hurt. Eleanor heard all of it. She had lived long enough to recognize the sound of doubt disguised as care. Her days filled again. Not with urgency, but with purpose. She worked slowly, deliberately, taking breaks when needed. Every stitch was an act of defiance against the idea that usefulness had an expiration date. One afternoon, a young man named Theo knocked on her door. He was shy, carrying a worn leather jacket. "My grandmother said you might help," he said. "This belonged to my father. I want to wear it to my wedding, but it doesn't fit." Eleanor examined the jacket, fingers tracing cracked seams. Leather remembers, she said. Just like people. She worked on it for days, hands aching, back sore. When Theo returned, she helped him try it on. It fit perfectly. Theo's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, he whispered. This means more than you know. After he left, Eleanor sat alone, jacket's absence still warm in her hands. She realized then that she hadn't just started sewing again. She had reopened a doorway. To connection, to relevance, to joy. Her health wavered at times. There were days she couldn't sew at all. Days when pain demanded rest. But even then, she planned. Sketched designs. Dreamed. On her 91st birthday, Margaret organized a small gathering. A few neighbors. Cake. Tea. Laughter. Someone brought a handmade sign, "It's never too late." Eleanor smiled, but later that evening, she stood alone by the window again, watching the sun sink into the sea. She knew she wouldn't do this forever. She knew time was still moving forward, indifferent and unstoppable. But she also knew something else now, something people forget too easily. Starting again isn't about how much time you have left. It's about refusing to live as if you're already gone. At 90, Eleanor Whitmore didn't reclaim her youth. She didn't erase loss or outrun age. She simply chose not to surrender the part of herself that still wanted to create. And that was enough, because when everyone else had given up on what she could still become, Eleanor had not. She had started again.